So John Locke, to give you a little bit of history, went to Oxford, right? Excuse me. He went to Oxford at age 20, studied at Christ Church, which is one of the colleges at Oxford. The way Oxford and Cambridge are organized is fairly different from universities here, right? So you have the total university, which is the collection of colleges, of the individual colleges, right, or halls, right? Similar to the way that you have individual departments at American universities. So Christ Church is one of the colleges or buildings where students like they dorm, they do most of their work. They have the individual colleges have individual libraries that you have access to as a student of that college, and so forth and so forth. And there are professors associated with the college. And then the departments are kind of just spread, as it were, spread out between all the colleges. Okay, so he went to Christ Church at Oxford, where he studied philosophy, and he was not a fan of the classical philosophers. Yes, he studied them, yes, he thought some of their ideas were good, but he thought ultimately that their time in the sun had faded, right? It was, they were being cast in shadow by the new contemporary crowd, which included Thomas Hobbes, right? And a young John Locke was very, very much enamored with Hobbes' own theory of the original condition in society developing out of human nature. But he disagreed vehemently with the status of that original condition, right? Humans in that original condition, and with what human nature was. So he thought that, unlike Hobbes, who thought that the original condition would be a war of all against all, constant state of war between humans for resources, he thought that if humans are individualistic, right, and in constant competition, that means that, the population is going to be a lot smaller than than in modern day societies. Therefore, there would be an abundance of resources, and so there would be no real need for direct competition, right? So even if we are driven by animal nature, right, that can't be, according to Locke, what defines human nature, right? What's going to define human nature, and therefore the revolution from from individuals who just happen to be in proximity to each other to societies, is going to be reason and tolerance, according to Locke. It's worth noting, according to Locke, was one of those Enlightenment philosophers who, uh, you know, whose ideas, when taken in the abstract, very, very well, they seem very, very nice, but when you combine them with his actual personal views, especially given the time, right? 1632 to 1704 is when he lived. You you get racism that bleeds in, right? Like direct racism, including the idea that as he put it, Negroes are subhuman. So it doesn't actually pan out that every human is a part of his human nature. And again, like with Kant and Kant's own racism, it's something that we should acknowledge as being part of their own theorizing, but not an essential feature that we need to bring in when we talk about this idea that human societies evolve by reason and tolerance. I think our own legal system is kind of clearly, rather clearly showcases that Locke was wrong even in that regard. But it's a nice thought, at the very least. and it's worth pursuing, thinking about what would society actually look like if it was directed by reason and tolerance. It's a good guiding light, perhaps, for revising society going forward, if nothing else. Anyway, so he was irritated with those classical philosophers, was very fond of the contemporary, quote-unquote, contemporary philosophers, such as Hobbes, Descartes, and Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes and Francis Bacon, who were doing more early scientific thinking, we would call it. Not that that was lacking in classical philosophy, but it was at the heart of these thinkers, where it was only at the heart of some of classical philosophers. So Locke wrote 2 treatises on government, which was a criticism against absolute monarchy, in the sense that Hobbes sort of tacitly defends. It should be noted that Hobbes wasn't saying, Thomas Hobbes wasn't saying in Leviathan that this is how government should be. Rather, like Rene Descartes, sorry, not Rene Descartes, David Hume, and David Hume's moral theory, he was saying this is how societies did evolve, right? Or come to be. So this is just how they are, right? Because this is how human nature is. In much the same way that Hume was saying the same thing about this is how the mind works, and this is how morality therefore works, or our moral thinking works. So it's the same sort of principle there. And Locke winds up being a lot like Immanuel Kant, in that his response is that, oh, no, 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 this isn't just how societies work, this is how societies should be, right? So by saying that human nature is defined by reason and tolerance, he says that it's essentially rational, right? So we go from this state of nature where everything is abundant and we don't exist in direct competition with each other, to society. But how? How do we make this transition? Well, since everything is abundant, we sort of just demarcate, demarcate mine versus yours, as it were, and create the notion of property. Right? I find a plot of land that suits my needs and my desires, say with an apple tree and a section of river for water, and I can make a decent living, or I can live decently in that space. And then you find one nearby that has an orange grove and meat, right, in the form of, I don't know, chickens or something. And you claim that spot of land as yours. But there are clearly things that each of us have that the other needs. So if this is my spot of land and that's your spot of land, then how do we go about, according to reason, and you tolerating my presence here, and us mutually tolerating each other's nearby presences, then in order for land, or in order to for you to access the water that you need, and for me to go, have some of your chickens, we have to exchange property. So we have to develop in the first place the notion of property, which, according to Locke, is a natural right, different from the Hobbesian sense. Right? It's something that's ours by dint of fact that our labor created it. Our monitoring the apples, or picking the apples, making them mine. My creating a small dam so that, or an offshoot for irrigation purposes, from the river so that I can collect water makes that water mine. Same way that you penning in the chickens and tending to the orange grove make those things yours. So it's through labor, first and foremost, and this is before um, Adam Smith and capitalism, but it is a fundamental notion and argument that went into Adam Smith's creation of capitalism, right, as an economic theory. So through labor, what is mine versus what is yours is established, right? And this is what is essential to the development of society. We now have lines of boundaries, right? Reason tells us that, okay, that's not mine, and tolerance puts us in close proximity to each other. So, again, coming from a plentiful state of nature, there's no reason for competition, so it's through cooperation that societies start developing. We start cooperating more and more with our neighbors, for lack of a better term, until, in order to manage the cooperation, right, the scale of cooperation extends to a point where we need, again, laws, a means of regulating trade, right? And so we develop a barter system, and the bartering system becomes the very basis of society. But then we get to the point where in our cooperation, we're bartering for things that we don't need, just things, and instead things that we just want. And so we move from a bartering system to a currency-based system, and this is where inequality creeps in. Right? So the exchange of property and resources, basis of society, the exchange of currency for resources is where equality creeps in, because now you're saying, and now you start putting an equivalent sort of value, well, not value, but a concrete way of measuring value, the value of a thing, besides the fact that I need it, right? Since we've moved past need into exchanging for the sake of desires, right? Uh, the hard value of currency, which isn't supposed to fluctuate in Locke's world, diluted as it is, means that you can start placing an actual, I don't want to reuse the word value, but value on the level of work that goes into something, right? So oranges might be more plentiful overall, which means that each individual orange costs less than meat, right? Than the meat of a chicken, because raising one chicken takes more materials, uh, supposedly, than one orange bush does to maintain one orange bush. And so inequality starts to creep in, because now you're not valuing things for their necessity, but rather in an artificial manner. So, in essence, for Locke, money is the root of all evil, quite literally. So, as I said, society sort of turns on this policy of reason and toleration. And first, we get the laws, right? The means of regulation, right? The rules by which things are regulated. So that's legislature comes first. And then we get the need, then we see that we need some means of enforcing this. And so the executive branch comes next. And then finally, some way of creating new laws or revising existing laws, some way of debating wrongs under the system. And so we get a judicial branch next, and this mirrors the U.S. Constitution, or rather, the U.S. Constitution was framed in the mirror to mirror this idea of society. Right? One other very important aspect on this idea of the justice, right? Specifically of legitimacy and authority of government. Like I said, Locke was an admirer of Hobbes, but he didn't fully agree with what Hobbes had to say, especially this idea that society should, or just develops in such a way that totalitarianism is sort of permissible as a natural occurrence. He grew up during, I believe it was the Tudor Revolution, and he was actually a political refugee. Locke was a political refugee in Holland, right? Which was it Holland? Sorry, no. Yeah, Holland. Holland or Denmark, one of the two, which was the first constitutional monarchy, uh, functionally a democracy in the world, right? Where the people decided who ruled them. Well, not in the world. You had Athens beforehand, but whatever. In the modern world, in Europe. I say as though Greece isn't a part of Europe. You know what I mean. So Locke fled England because he thought that the authoritarian divine right of kings that England operated under was a mistaken premise. Right? He thought that mankind has a duty to society and a duty to government, and that these are separate. The distinction between the two is that the duty to society is your duty to your fellow man. Right? Your duty to government is so duty to society is duty to fellow man and their well-being and their collective well-being. Duty to government is the duty to the individual form of government under which you live. Right? To be a good citizen of England or Holland or Germany or the United States. But between the two, the duty to society is the primary, right? Because because society should follow human nature, should be dictated by tolerance and reason. Sometimes governments get too big for their britches, and they get too caught up in their own sense of power, and so they start making unreasonable or intolerant policies. And when they do that, then the duty to society, he says, should compel man to rebel against the government, because their duty to government is to see it change, to see to see that government change for one that is guided more by reason and tolerance than its current form. Now that can be violent revolution, which was typically what he had in mind, or that can be through protest and demands of reform as well. And so when the designated government dissolves, the unjust government dissolves, men do so when it dissolves due to instability or revolution or whatever, men still remain obligated to society. They still have the duty to society. And in this regard, therefore, according to Locke, anarchism is never an ultimate end. It's a means towards the end. Anarchism is the expression of the duty to society against unjust governments. Right? Or so it should. Right? And that duty to society after the upending of the dissolution of the former unjust government requires that what remains, the population, the people, collectively determine the future course of the society, and what form the new government should take. So his idea, in his mind, society was sort of constantly moving and progressing towards uh, republics or democracies, as it were. And this paints a very, very different view from the more contemporary thinker, and one of the last real uh, greats within this tradition of social contract theorist, John Rawls.